Hi guys, welcome back to My Steps to Sobriety, my show on YouTube and as a podcast with me, your host, Stefan Neff. Another fantastic day for an interview. And whilst I'm always sort of excited to be an interview, sometimes the topics that we bring out, you think, why the hell can he be so excited? The reason is simple. The reason I tried in the past to escape from reality was because of the trauma that I had experienced in my life. Now, trauma comes in so many shapes, and every person is different, every trauma is different. However, there are so many parallels, so many similarities amongst the survivors of trauma that it is just mind-blowing. Yet, trauma survivors typically are trapped in the belief that, oh my God, this happens never to anyone else. How could it have happened to me? And the shame and the guilt, and put all that together, and then that's why you shut up, and that's why you try to escape. And I'm doing this show with the help of some beautiful guests who are coming and actually sharing their stories with me here, so that you guys out there see, actually, wow, that happened to him. Well, actually, that happened to me too. And Tim Mousseau here is today my guest. And Tim, I'm so grateful that you're on my show, because we're going to be talking about some hard truths, some hard trauma, and I'm so grateful that you have made it your mission to bring hope to others, so that maybe their life can change. So Tim Mousseau, welcome to my show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and just grateful for the opportunity. As I know you mentioned, it's sexual violence and abuse comes up so often when we think about trauma, and that shame piece and the isolation is such a huge component of it. And it was very helpful for me early on in my own journey to hear other survivors who are able to speak up and tell their story, because it demystifies it and it takes away such a stigma. So thank you for the opportunity and the platform.
And it's, guys, if you watch this show and have been following me, you will find quite a few interviews that I've done with sexual abuse survivors. And it is weird. You think, oh, come on, that is sexual abuse. That must be rare. That never ever happens. Actually. What are the figures, Tim? If people sort of come with a certain degree of disbelief to you, what figures do you quote them?
Yeah, so best research we have on it is about, and actually this one just came out from a study that was done by the World Health Organization in the last year. And that was that 1 in 3 women will experience some form of sexual abuse or violence in their lifetime, right? And then we also know that about 1 in 6 men will experience some form of sexual abuse or violence. And I think whenever I talk about those figures, the thing I always try and clarify for people is that abuse and violence are such broad umbrella terms that I think so often when we hear about that, we think of things like violent, penetrative rape. Absolutely. That is a form of sexual violence and sexual abuse, but it can be anything, right? So yes, it can be rape or sexual assault. It's sexual harassment, physically or verbally. It's unwanted touching or groping. It's things like stalking, in person or electronically. It's, intimate partner violence in a relationship. It's things like catcalling, or even sending a nude photo or video without someone's permission or consent, right? And so I try and help people understand that when you hear that number, and if you're only thinking of the worst, most egregious violent behaviors, I think that's why some people have that resistance of, oh, that's too high, that can't be possible. But we know it's you look at all of these behaviors in sum and in their totality, I think that's where you can see the prevalence really coming in.
And I think that's really so important. What you're already alluding to, because the sexual violence and abuse is such a broad term, it makes it very difficult to actually delineate. I can see it happen that a lot of probably men more than women will say, "What, me? I would never do that. I mean, come on, look at me. I'm a leader in my field. I'm I go to church every Sunday. You're kidding me that I would be sexually violent." What would you say there?
Yeah, it's trying to reconcile who's perpetrating abuse and, what type of behaviors they're engaging in, right? So I think that anytime I talk to audiences and they get defensive, I think that overwhelmingly, no one, I think, ever sits in my program and says, yes, I would choose to do this, right? The people who do aren't going to admit that publicly. And more often than not, everyone gets that defensiveness of, I'm a good person, kind of as you alluded to. I would never. And it's trying to break down, helping people understand that there's behaviors they're engaging in that can be predatory or can be violent that you may not perceive as such, right? So we look at individuals who are committing acts of sexual violence, and a lot of times when we study their motivations, we find that some people choose to do this. We know there's a subset of the population that chooses to engage in sexual violence, and they do it because of power and control, and the power and control it gives them. We also know that a large number of perpetrators or people who are perpetrating violence are doing so because their community has normalized those behaviors. So their community has told them, this is okay. This is the way you should engage in relationships. This is okay if it happens in your partnership or with a partner. This is a part of dating. This is something we're socialized to believe. And then there's kind of this third subsect that they're just ignorant. They haven't received education around things like consent or looking at boundaries and respecting someone's boundaries and seeking those out. And I have to try and help people reconcile again, an overwhelming majority are probably not in that first category of intentional predatory behavior for the sake of it. But we have a lot of people who are perpetrating or engaging in acts that are perpetrating violence, and trying to help them understand, just because your community told you this was okay, it doesn't take away the impact of the actions. Certainly the harm might be different. The way that someone experiences that harm, the way you might reconcile or deal with that harm if you violated someone's boundaries or consent can absolutely be different. But there can still be an incident that occurs, even if you don't mean to or intend to. Your own intentions don't lessen that actual behavior just because others have told you that's normal or okay.
Very, very powerful words there, and very lovely delineated the various drivers that result in men and women crossing boundaries that they might not know are there, or even if they know they are there, they override them because it fits into their belief system. If you take the worst group there, if you take the sexual predators out there, is that am I too naive to say that if I look at a group of 1% in the population, which are sociopaths and psychopaths, that group of sexual predators will overlap with sociopaths, psychopaths? Or are we actually talking about a rather smaller overlap there? If you look at people who are really wanting to do that, who are these people?
Yeah, so the best research we have, one of the things I always like to talk about is, first and foremost, we know that regardless of the gender of the survivor, roughly 90% of incidents are perpetrated by men, right? So that's a huge factor of the work I do. And there's a lot of, socialization that men receive growing up and the way we're taught to think about sex and talk about sex and seek out sex and all of those pieces that change our behaviors. So if we look at, 90% of assaults or sexual violence is perpetrated by men, when we narrow down, we find that the best number we could find was about 6% of men would willfully engage in acts of sexual violence if they were given an opportunity. So through that assessment and survey, what we were finding is that men were saying, even if I knew this was wrong, if I was, even though I do know this was wrong, if I knew I wasn't going to get caught, I would do these things. I would engage in these behaviors. I would, regardless of what it is, right?
That's and 1 in 20.
Yeah, it's an alarmingly high number. It's alarming in how large it is. And I think it points to this kind of overarching pervasive narrative of oftentimes how we view sexual violence versus other crimes, which again complicates and muddies the water when we talk about who's perpetrating it and survivors and why there's a stigma around it. I think that this thing that I think a lot of times people don't reconcile is that because every one of us essentially engages in sex, right? We all have sex unless we identify as asexual. Most of us are going to do it at least once in our lifetime or multiple times, multiple partners, right? And I think because of that, a lot of times we fail to see the difference between sex and sexual violence. If you hear someone committed an act of murder, you might, be surprised by it or shocked because that person. You can say, wow, that's really, crazy. But if you have all this evidence and data that points to this person doing that, you're probably going to believe it. Versus with sexual violence, I think the problem is that we can't always separate our own innate sexual behaviors from the idea of sexual violence. And so I think for many of us, we look at it and say, well, I engage in sex. And so it kind of muddies our own perception of it.
Yeah.
And then I think the other side of it is that when we look at the willingness, and that's such a high level of individuals who are willing to actually commit acts of sexual violence, that survey didn't discern between the type, right? So that was the other thing. So that's not necessarily saying that 6% would willfully engage in violent penetrative rape. It might be that some of them were saying, okay, well, I'd be willing to engage in catcalling. I would be willing to engage in, inappropriate jokes or sexual harassment.
Yeah.
Again, not okay in any way, shape, or form. I think the one thing with that we're saying is that it just shows how little people treat sexual violence and how kind of in their mind they are willing to make excuses for behaviors, right?
Yeah.
They know something's wrong. They've been told it's wrong. They've been told it's not okay. But in their mind, they're drawing this line between, violent penetrative rape's an awful thing, but what's the harm in catcalling someone? What's the harm in touching someone, inappropriate, right? They're not seeing it as that true violation of self and really the harm it is.
Mm. And that's so important, isn't it? It is one thing, your beliefs and what you think is happening, but the perception of the other person might be so different and often is so different. And wow, okay, first of all, the 6% are still, wow, okay, come on. That is still weird, absolute weird. Yeah. I'm struggling with that. Because may I ask, where was this study done? And did it take into account different belief systems, different, was it done in a more Islamic country or in a United States? If so, was it only Catholics that were examined, or do you know a bit more about it?
It was a American-based study done with college-age men, right? And so that's kind of, shows some of the, like I said, parameters of the background of where it is and stuff. And I think that still is fairly alarming, and looking at that sample size and looking at the number of people they interviewed and how large it was, of just like, you don't expect that, right? You don't expect them to have that, viscerally disgusting of a response of, if I knew I could get away with it, I would.
Exactly.
Especially, I think, when you look at the level of education that most college students receive around sexual violence and the conversations that are going on college campuses, I think that's where it becomes extremely frightening in that regard. So.
And you also have to say that we are now talking about a study that was recently done, so 2-3 years after Me Too. So you cannot really say, come on, sexual violence, I never heard about that. Me Too, I don't know what that is. Oh, come on. So you would have expected some change in parameters, in attitude. The 6%, that still blows my mind. I mean, I'm really struggling with that figure of people who are willing to do things if they can get away with it. There is something deeply, deeply wrong with that. But I mean, that is still probably the smaller amount of people, or a tiny amount of people, compared with the much bigger groups of people, of those who are just simply ignorant and had not been educated about it, and those that for them it has been normalized. The more societal norms in certain subgroups of our societies can be quite fostering of behavior that really, when you look at it, can be seen as sexual violence, and I mean, I automatically want to prevent myself having the stereotypes flashing up as in Islamic society or things like that. I think it's I don't want to label it, I don't want to nicely pigeonhole it, but yet, I mean, there are probably so many examples of societal groups that are falling into that trap. What do you see commonly in the United States? What kind of groups do you work with where actually a maybe toxic masculinity is being normalized?
Yeah, so I think it's true for the United States, and I think it can apply in so many places, like you said. A lot of times what we're finding is very patriarchal systems. So, and this is something that has extended across the last century, really. So anytime men are being socialized from a young age to believe and are taught these ideas like, well, you have to be the provider. And with that, oftentimes comes messaging that to be a provider means being aggressive, not taking no for an answer, going out and getting what you want. You have to achieve at the cost of others. Well, when you look at those beliefs and they start to trickle out, it is, a lot of men aren't being taught how to respond to a no or to this idea of rejection. So for them, that's something they're unfamiliar with. Other pieces of it are a lot of traditional concepts around stoicism, not displaying emotions, not showing what you're feeling. Well, the side effect of that we know is that many men don't grow up in groups where they learn how to read someone else's nonverbal cues. Because, starting around the age of like 6 and 7 here in the United States, for example, most men are taught that you should only show really happiness or sadness in extreme circumstances. You can show anger all the time, and then all other emotions you kind of should contain, right? Well, when you start to think about that, and we start to see research around it, we're finding that many men are more likely to misread their partner's cues in a sexual situation when they're provided nonverbally. So we've done studies where we found that, if we engage with and had conversation with couples, we were seeing that men were significantly misreading cues where they would say, well, I thought my partner was consenting. I thought they were okay with this through nonverbal responses. And then you would interview the partner and they would say, no, I wasn't. That's not at all what I was doing. But again, it comes into this, well, you were taught this stuff growing up. And then I think the other piece is we do know in a lot of cultures, especially here in the United States, there's really this push that as a man, you have to be the one to initiate sex. Again, it goes back to some of the patriarchal role, protector, provider, the dominant figure. And so for many men, if you're taught from a young age, you have to be the one who initiates sex, but then we're also not providing them skills. So that's especially true here in the United States. Sex education is an abysmally done thing here. What you find is that men aren't learning those skills anywhere. They're stumbling into situations where their innate perception is, I have to be the one that initiates this, but they've never been taught what that means. And it's not like they're going to go educate themselves around it. If in the best of case scenarios, they have a partner who might educate them, more often than not, they're just skipping steps and they're jumping over things because they've never been taught it and they don't really know how to find that information. It's not, a common search topic we think of. And so instead of learning how to, talk with your partner about sex or what it means to initiate it or how to give them the opportunity in a relationship so they can understand they can initiate it as well, a lot of guys are just kind of skipping over that piece. And so they're missing out on all these other pieces that allow consent to be established, boundaries to be respected and discussed and built and all those kind of pieces because they just never were taught that.
Yet, I've been hear you saying there are all these studies happening that are looking at college students and at that. So, and you would have thought that knowing that 1 in 5 college students will experience sexual violence as a female. That was sort of the figures that I had in my mind. There must be a stronger drive towards education. There must be a stronger drive towards elucidating the reasons why men do what they do. There must be targeted marketing, so to speak, advertising towards the jock culture, towards the kind of, yeah, I'm a man. And that has its place. When you are a type A personality in a team, in a sports team, well, that's how you beat yourself up. That's how you, yes, let's go onto the field. And yes, okay, that makes it strong. And funnily enough, the girls like that. That's after all. So let's not be silly. There is a reason that we men behave the way we behave. The strong masculinity is can be a magnet to many, many women. And so we are not, I don't think both of us are saying anything against it. So don't misunderstand us if you're the viewers out there. What we are saying is to learn to be able to listen, even whilst you're displaying such strong traits that serve you well in many aspects of your career and in your school, etc., in your college. But when do where do you draw the line? When do you say, whoa, this is actually no longer okay, what I'm doing here? And I can see that is being incredibly hard. And that is really what you want to teach.
Yeah, it's trying. I think a lot of times when I do masculinity programs, so regardless of the age of the audience, whether it's high schoolers, college students, young professionals, anyone, it's trying to help people reconcile a lot of the rigidity that we're taught. I think one of the very dangerous pieces of masculinity is that it's very heavily reinforced. And it's so interesting because whenever I talk to men on an individual level and I ask them about the masculine values they possess and they hold and why, especially, you hear these really beautiful stories of, I was taught this by my father. I was taught this by a family member, a coach, a mentor, an authority figure, a brother, a teammate. And because of that, I think everyone likes to look at their masculinity on this very personal level. Yeah. One of the big things that comes out of that, though, is people miss out on how that's being applied on a group level. And also then, as I mentioned, that term rigidity. Inherently, I tell all men, there's no necessarily negative value. If you value dominance, great. If you value physical strength, fantastic. Sure. Even those are traditional masculine values. If that's your value, sure. You have to be willing to look at what is the impact of that? How is it impacting both yourself as well as others? And I think that the bigger piece then is there that negative rigidity to it? Are you going to hold on to it no matter what? And are you going to enforce it upon others no matter what? Because if you can't be flexible, if you can't be willing to critique it or critique the impacts of it, that's where I think it gets scary. But I think that's why so many men feel trapped into these situations where, a lot of times when I've dealt with groups and organizations where an incident of violence has occurred. So a lot of times in my work, I might come in because there was a public facing incident, and I'm usually working with other members of that group after the fact, right? And a lot of times what I'll hear is, we're not okay with that. That doesn't embody us. That's not who we are. We're bothered by it. We don't like that. And there's this kind of instinctual, we want to separate ourselves from that person. We want to say they're a bad apple, we're not, right? And it's trying to get them to understand, well, what values were you exhibiting that let this person think that was okay?
Exactly.
How were you challenging them? Because I think that's a big piece. It's like so many people are not okay with this, but they're also afraid of challenging that group norm because it becomes so oppressive. And I think masculinity it can be something that is so rigidly enforced on so many people that we say we want to change it. And I think people do, but the second you go against it, you're ostracized, you're made fun of, you're mocked, you're talked down to. And so you find yourself doing it, even if you don't believe in it, but that has impacts. It changes the way we navigate the world. It changes the way we work with partners. It changes the way we have these conversations. And so I think we have to have that kind of honesty and that bluntness with ourselves to say, yeah, if we're part of these groups, it can be challenging. It can be hard to be the person who stands up and calls things out, but you have to be willing to do that. You have to be willing to start to push because someone must. And all of us have to, I think, be a little more flexible in allowing that to occur and recognizing when we can be the person standing up in our groups and pushing back.
It's very, very true, isn't it? And I see all sides of the story because I'm 56 and I was brought up in Germany, and the values that certainly my father instilled in me was that you're a successful man if you can lay as many women as you can. Now, sexual violence was never part of it, but the goal was to go to bed with a woman every night, different woman every night, and that made you a man. there are some really fucked up things there. So you could, please, let's be clear. Yet I find it intriguing there that this kind of masculinity was normalized. It was normalized in advertisements. It was normalized in James Bond, in the films that we watched, the way women behaved. It takes two to tango. So women were quite happily sexually active. And certainly if you go a little bit further back, once the pill came into the life of many women, and suddenly the society completely changed. Now you could actually have sex, and the hippie movement, the free sexual exploration of life started when there were no more consequences. So bottom line is, there's a difference between us growing up in different environments and with different belief systems, yet recognizing the limit of no, the limit of actually there is a line in the sand. However wrong I perceive nowadays my values from that time, there was still nowhere that I stepped over the mark. And I wonder why. Why did I not, with that kind of more or less toxic masculinity, why did I not become a perpetrator? What made me different? And that is weird. And I don't actually have an answer. I guess I've never thought about that question, but here I am, having all the wrong guidance, all the wrong, living in a society where that kind of behavior was normalized. Yet, to the best of my knowledge, I've never stepped across a boundary.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it comes down to underlying things you might be taught about power, right? Because I think that certainly comes into play. And, earlier, I know I mentioned how men respond to rejection. Because I think and this is what trying to get some people to reconcile is, there is a large difference between sex positivity and this idea of having and engaging in sex as often as you want and as much as you like, and not shaming someone for their sexual values, and being able to have consequence-free sex outside of monogamous relationships, and being taught that your value is tied to it. Right. I think that's when you were talking, that's the piece that some people forget and they fail to recognize, is that there's this difference between saying, I want to have multiple sexual partners and I have to have multiple sexual partners because it defines my worth. And I have to do that because I think when you approach it from this is something I like and I enjoy, nothing wrong with that. When you approach it from I have to do this to feel this way, again, then you're probably more likely to miss out on your partner's cues. You're more likely to ignore those cues, even if they're being provided to you, because in your mind, this person's stopping you from a sense of conquest and stopping you from a sense of achievement, right? You stop when you think of a partner as a object of providing you worth, the large risk you run is that you are diminishing them as a person and you're not thinking of them from that empathetic standpoint. And then I think sometimes what people fail to recognize is that there's a piece of luck involved in that too. Right. Like I think sometimes it's just potentially that, in the situations we choose to engage in, we never ran into a situation where we made someone uncomfortable or violate their boundaries. And I think that's the thing I oftentimes tell audiences, if you're not actively pausing to seek out consent and taking a step back and thinking about all these interior pieces of your identity and why you're doing it, and engaging with yourself and asking those honest questions about your motivations and how you're treating partners because of them. Sometimes it's a matter of luck, and I think that really comes down to that second category of people who are engaging in the behaviors that are potentially predatory or violent, and they don't perceive it as such because they don't think themselves capable of those things, but they're still capable of causing harm, because there is that chance. And it's just a matter of who have your partners been, and, how are they expressing their boundaries and how are they expressing consent?
Beautifully said, because that is the gray zone, and that will be the biggest zone, isn't it? Where people say, no, I would never rape a woman, yet certain behaviors are actually acceptable to you, and to actually put a spotlight on that and make you accept that you are so inclined, that you have such belief systems. And if we never think about them and certainly never talk about them, how the hell can it come out? But in absolutely the wrong moment, when everything is on the line and you have to make that choice. Do I push further, or do I want to understand that this nonverbal communication actually means bugger off. No, don't want to.
Yeah.
And I think that's the big thing. Intriguing. But it's such a multifaceted issue, the sexuality and the way we talk. Because I know, Tim, you are very strong in regards to the atmosphere that is leading to it. What do you allow in organizations to occur to more or less facilitate a path towards sexual assault? And I must say that that many groups in our society have got a very strong humor and a very humor that is often sexually explicit, that is often extreme in their nature, and that's often people like me, doctors, nurses. We can have very black humors, policemen, firemen, soldiers, people who see the reality of life. We often have got a fatalistic humor, and it goes pretty brutal. It is very hard. I mean, how do I draw the line there between making some joke that I consider innocent, and how do I prevent that being seen by someone else as a sexual harassment? How do you help people with that kind of attitude?
Yeah, I think there's two sides to it. I think the first is sometimes reconciling and understanding what is the context, right? So I think that's a huge piece, because we know context changes. We know context does matter in many situations, right? So I think about things like, when you study food service industries, right? So either restaurants or bars, there's oftentimes a higher level of inter-office relationships. A lot of times you're seeing that, or I guess not office, but inter-workplace relationships, right? Where you see that just because of sometimes age, proximity to people, physically, all of those kind of things, that oftentimes there's a lot higher level of people within those work environments engaging in inner work relationships, as opposed to maybe like a, accounting firm or financial services and such, right? And so in that kind of situation, and some of the ones you mentioned, certainly you can say, hey, there's this context. This is the way that within this environment, this has been contextualized, and this is kind of grounded in the core of what's happening and the type of environment that's been created. And so I think sometimes it's knowing the context you're in and understanding and paying attention to that context and really making sure that you're aware of it as you choose to engage in behaviors, and being also aware of how can you separate that. Because then I think the second piece is, are you also thinking about the intentionality of what you're doing and the impact of what you're doing? Because I think intentionality does matter in the impact area, but I think we have to reconcile, sometimes I think people get caught in their ways and they get so, well, this is the way it's been. Why can't people adapt to it? And I think we have to realize that life progresses, time progresses, our perceptions of things progress. And just because something has always been that way doesn't mean it's right, or doesn't mean we were actually listening, doesn't mean it's okay, and doesn't mean that people were okay with it ever, right? I think sometimes we have to be willing to, kind of look at things that we hold dear and say, hey, is this serving us or not?
Beautiful. Yeah. Absolutely beautifully said, isn't it? And things are changing. Things that were normal in the 70s, in the 80s. It is, you think you're kidding me. A while ago, there was a television series, Life on Mars, and somehow a New York policeman is having a head injury and is somehow beamed back into the 70s in the same police precinct, and is now with a modern mind. He can recognize everything, but he is living in the 70s, and it's beautifully done. The sexism, the smoking, the using violence on people in interrogations, things like that, perfectly done. And when you look at it from that angle, you have to say, bloody hell, we hopefully have come a long way. And then you think, actually, have we? Or are we still on a journey there that actually needs to be constantly reflected upon and see? I love it how you say that, see if your behavior is still making sense and is serving a purpose. If I do a sexually explicit joke at work and I manage to decompress the situation and everyone just bursts out in stupid laughter because it's such a stupid joke, then I've achieved a goal. And I don't think I will have necessarily harmed someone, but people will recognize that, okay, I allowed a very tense situation to just like suddenly crack. And that is a beautiful thing. The same joke in relation, if I was alone with a woman, maybe a nurse where I'm a doctor, so you've got already that power difference. And if I now say, oh, that little joke about the tits, that's probably a very different story compared with the first thing. So I love the way that you say the context matters a lot. And you can point that out. So, for example, in our theater environment, in the hospital in which I'm working, most of us are about the same age, and we all have been around the block a few times. And when we come up with humor like that, then we do it on purpose, and it is everyone takes turns of being the target of that humor. Absolutely fine. Sometimes we have got student nurses coming into theater, and all of us are making damn well sure whatever happens in theater stays in theater, number one. Number two, it is what you see there are coping mechanisms to deal with stress that have been evolved in our environment over a long period of time. So you can actually spell that out to people to contextualize and to make people understand what is happening rather than affront them and maybe hurt them, and maybe they misunderstand things because the way what has been happening in their life is so different than what has been happening in our longer life. So
Yeah.
maybe that might be a way to look at it.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned the power dynamics, which I think is so important, right? Because I think so often when I hear people talk about this, that's a key that people are missing is, I think that if you and I are on the same power level right now, even, in this conversation, there's kind of the capability for me to call things out in a different way, right? Because, if you said something, I could say, look, I'm not going to do this anymore. I could walk off and I could stop the interview, right?
Yeah.
But there's kind of that difference of if I'm someone's supervisor and they rely on me for a job, that power dynamic doesn't exist. If they rely on me for an internship or the fact that I have to sign off on things at the end of the day, or if they're my student, or, a lot of times, like when I'm on stage and I'm working with an audience, I have to be careful what I say because they've been told you have to be in this room and you have to listen to this guy. And so there's that power dynamic. And I think a lot of times people, they forget that exists, or they're unwilling to address it and acknowledge it. And I think that's where, sometimes people get very defensive is in their mind, again, they focus on what they're trying to accomplish, but they're missing all this nuance and they're unwilling to look at the nuance. And they're saying, well, I've said these jokes with other people. I said these jokes 10 years ago. I said these jokes in this kind of situation. Sure. Why is it a problem now? And, like you said, stuff changes, A. B, we have to think about power, because I think that's a hard thing for a lot of people is just because you've always said it doesn't necessarily mean everyone was always comfortable with it. It might have been the case that they didn't have the power to call it out and you were just ignoring that and you never heard it, right? And I think that's the thing about so many incidents of sexual harassment we see in the workplace and that's occurring is a lot of times it goes unreported, right? You know what I mean? Like we know that about 87 to 94% of employees who face sexual harassment don't ever say anything about it. And I think that's something that's shocking to a lot of people is that I think with Me Too and so many public facing movements, people are expecting a lot more conversations around it. When more often than not, the majority of times people who are experiencing it aren't speaking up. And many times they just leave. They leave the company, they leave the organization, they find a new team to be a part of because they don't have the power to say anything. And again, that's where I think it's hard for people because they're like, well, why am I hearing this now? And it's like, well, hey, if this has been going on, there's a chance it's never been okay. Just no one felt like they could say that to you.
Very powerful. Very, very true. And certainly here in New Zealand, there is the tall poppy syndrome. If you speak out, if you say something, you get cut off. And that is whistleblowing here is career suicide, ultimately. And regrettably, I've seen quite a few examples of that, and I'm living through one right now where a colleague is blowing the whistle, and it is not pretty to see what is happening.
Yeah.
I think the other thing we need to say is also that not everyone is right in the head, and that sounds maybe derogatory, but let me explain. I said already earlier, 1% of the society are psychopath, sociopaths, really nasty pieces of work. 10% of the society have got a personality disorder. And there are various personality disorders, but for example, a narcissistic personality disorder, these people, they are hardwired in a very different way than you and I. They don't see any harm they do. They don't have the empathy that you would expect under certain circumstances. Now, if you look at personality disorders and you say 1 in 10, well, that's 1 in 10 people that you work with. And some of them are the quirky nerds, maybe. Some of them are the very needy people. Some of them, there are a number of personality disorders. So by no means want to sort of do a broad brush over it. But I want to say, hang on, there's some people who are just thinking very differently than you. And they might not see your cues. They might not see you actually saying, hey, you hurt me. What they understand is something very different, even if you were to spell it out.
Yeah, I think especially when you bring up like narcissistic personality disorder and that lack of empathy, right? Because I think that's a huge piece is when we look at so many behaviors of sexual violence, there has to be that empathy of recognizing when someone has told you that you've done something wrong and the desire to remedy it. And I think that's especially true when it's not, the egregious acts of violence, right? I think it's if most of us, if someone came to us and said, hey, you made me feel uncomfortable with that joke, we might feel defensive initially because we might say, oh, I was just trying to make a joke. But I think that for many of us, there's that kind of initial reaction of once we get over our defensiveness, we might have that oh shit moment of, oh my God, I didn't think I was that type of person. Have I said something else? Have I done something else wrong? How can I fix this kind of thing? But then you share that startling number of, hey, if there's these people who don't have that empathy, it's like, yeah, they're just going to say, okay,
And it's hard. But I think the flow-on thought in my head automatically is, well, therefore it becomes so important to speak out and to say, hey, did you really mean it the way you said that? Because it really actually hurt me. And you therefore open up a conversation. You therefore, rather than being aggressive and maybe confrontational, you can say, actually, the way you spoke there really got close to me. The way you touched me there really made me feel uncomfortable. And you can say it like that. And it doesn't have to be a major confrontation, but you can just, by verbalizing it, you stand up to the other person, regardless where they are in their power scheme. It is a beautiful thing to actually speak out. I think it's okay to not be okay, but it's not okay to not seek help. It's not okay to shut up. It's not okay to keep suffering, because something is wrong somewhere. The suffering is there. It's either you, it can be, maybe you are in a headspace where you absolutely misunderstand, where your understanding might be different than had your headspace been different. Okay, so I was certainly in a time when I was depressed, when I was seeking refuge in alcohol. I was angry, I was resentful, I was everyone else's fault. Is you, look what you did. So there was never taking responsibility of myself. So if you're in that headspace, it's very easy to focus on someone else's actions and maybe even misrepresent them and misunderstand them. So there could be that argument, or that could be that thing going on in your life, but at the same token, yes, whilst that is still going on, the other person is still an asshole, the other person is still behaving very inappropriately. One way or the other, you need to address it. And one way or the other, we need to speak up. And I think that is so important, the speaking up. And the question is, how do you do that? How do you speak up? I mean, how do you encourage open conversation? What recommendations are you giving to people you work with?
Yeah, because I do a lot of work around, especially for my corporate clients, setting boundaries, how to talk about them, how to have conversations about what that looks like. I think there's a few things I would recommend. First and foremost, I would say understanding that if you have to know your boundaries first, right? And so sometimes I always recommend people pause and think about what those boundaries are. And they can be very broad and some of them are very shared, right? So, hey, we're not comfortable with sexual harassment. Yeah, generally that's a boundary that's shared across, dynamics, industries, cultures, companies, whatever, right? But some of our boundaries are very niched and nuanced. They're based on our personal traumas, our personal histories. I worked with a person once who was an account manager, and growing up, her parents were very driven around accomplishments. And a lot of times her mom would sit there, her mom wanted her to be an orchestra. And when she was playing, she would sit there and tap her foot and beat with the metronome. And years later, when that account manager had a manager who oversaw her, the manager would come in and would tap their pen against the notebook she was carrying. And she didn't realize how much anxiety and stress that was causing her. Now that's a very niche and personal boundary, but that's something that's worth recognizing, right? For me, when I experienced sexual harassment in the workplace, my boss used nicknames in a very derogatory way. Yeah. And it's taken me time to reconcile, that's a boundary of mine. One of my best friends who I know, first time I met him, just gave me a nickname. And it wasn't from a mean or demeaning place. That's just who he is. Yeah. But my initial reaction was to feel that anxiety and that tension of why would you do that, right? And so I think the first piece is it's good to explore our boundaries, because once we explore our boundaries, we can come up with language we can use to tell other people around those boundaries. Because the huge thing I always tell people is we don't need to over-explain what our boundaries are, but it's worth us having that information back of mind. Yeah. So with that friend, for example, with me, who gave me those nicknames, my reaction was just to accept it and move on. I was able to say, hey, this is a boundary that I hold that is very niche. I can understand this guy's intentions are very different. That's fine. That's whatever. But let's say it wasn't a work environment and I had a boundary around feedback or how I like to be communicated with. Maybe it stemmed from a place of trauma in my past. I don't need to share that. That's not something I would necessarily need to share with a boss or another individual. It's okay just to say, hey, I really don't like I don't like receiving feedback in person. Can you send it to me over email? Hey, it really makes me uncomfortable when you give me feedback in front of the team. Would you mind doing it one-on-one? And once we can talk about our boundaries, it's good for us to know the history. It's good for us to know the history because it's also good to know what we don't want to talk about. Exactly. But then once we set that, we can kind of negotiate what it is with our peers and our colleagues and our coworkers, because we may recognize hey, some of our boundaries absolutely shouldn't be violated. Some of them are going to change, right? As much as we can say, look, I don't want you to give me feedback in front of the team. Every once in a while, that's going to happen. So that gives us the ability to negotiate it, though, and understand where the other person's coming from. And then I think if someone has, violated a boundary, if someone's made a joke or a comment or said something to you, I think sometimes it's taking the time to remove yourself from that situation, especially if it's in a public facing situation, because calling that person out immediately can cause them to become defensive, and it can really heat tensions. And regardless of how you do it, if there's other people around, it might, again, lead to some kind of tense feelings or emotions. And so taking a step back, thinking for a second about what happened, why did it bother me? How can I contextualize this to the person? What do I need to share with them versus what am I going to keep to myself? Think about what is the channel to use, right? So sometimes it might be, hey, this keeps happening. This person seems to be doing this maliciously. This person really seems to be doing this to cause me problems or to hurt me. All right, well, then your recourse is probably going to be different than if it's, okay, this is a boss that I really trust. This was a one-time thing. I know them. I have a good trusting relationship with them. And then the last piece I always recommend is thinking about the idea of bystander intervention. And I think that's becoming a very popular topic for many companies in training, is helping also create a company culture where it's not just the person who might have experienced the harm or felt the boundary violation to be the one calling it out. Because that puts a lot of onus on them. And especially going back to that idea of power, there's a huge power differential. They may never feel comfortable talking about it. But if we can train our employees and our team to think about boundaries and then to think about how we're addressing that and to care about those topics, it might make it easier so that, hey, maybe the intern doesn't have to say where they felt uncomfortable, but me as your peer can say, hey, man, I saw what you said to them, and it seemed physically, it seemed like they were uncomfortable. Like, I just think, I know we make that joke, but like, you probably really should watch what you're doing. Or like, hey, I know you were upset. I know you were angry, but like next time, take a second, pause, step out of the room, breathe before you yell at the entire team, right? It gives us the opportunity when we know and have those skills to pay attention to the people around us. And, you know, when we kind of ingratiate that in our culture, it allows us to do a better job of having those conversations with each other and talking with each other. And it really is a skill that takes practice and time, but I think we have to be intentional in wanting to cultivate that skill. Because I think that even if you're coming from a place of helping someone grow, if you've never talked about that as a part of your culture or never talked about that as a part of your organization, it can feel very sudden. Versus if you come to, you know, from, you know, you set this container of this is the type of stuff we do here, I think it's going to be received much differently.
And it's beautiful. And it doesn't actually take so much from a leadership point of view, or from, if you anyhow practice good leadership, then you want to hear what negative things are happening. As a leader, I want to everyone in my team to be able to speak up. That is the crew resource management. That is the kind of principles where you want even the lowest member of the team having a chance to talk. And I foster that anyhow, because I know it will save my bacon over and over again. Why not foster the same thing with regards to feedback, with regards to something like that? I finish every theater session with, okay, list feedback, and typically there's nothing ever to say. So therefore, everyone already loves, because I'm saying thank you very much for your time and your effort today, and it's just a nice thing. And the odd time I forget it, people turn around and say, "Oi, you've forgotten something there," you know. But it is by doing that culture, by doing that that kind of openness, you actually invite people to speak up, and it's a beautiful thing. It is actually, you empower people. You empower the people around you to be truly part of a team. If you look at the frustration of burnout, it's often that people feel powerless and that they feel not heard with their concerns, etc. So if you are actually keen on having a viable team structure and actually a positive vibe, you want to prevent burnout. And essentially, we are talking about the same things there. And sexual explicit behavior or talk, etc., that makes some people rather uncomfortable. Well, that would be something that you could easily raise and address. And by doing so, that makes you a leader. And it doesn't matter if,
it's the idea of safety, right? I mean, I think it's how do we feel safe, right? I think so many of us think of safety as this physical thing, but it's the idea of, if I feel safe at work, I know my voice is going to be respected. My opinions I can share my opinions openly, and that my identities aren't going to be dismissed, that I can show up as I am, who I am, and that I'm not going to be mocked or made fun of or ridiculed or belittled because of that. Exactly. And when you feel safe, you're going to be a better employee. You're going to be more productive. You're going to be more engaged. You're going to make creative decisions. You're going to take risks because you're not afraid of the people around you and how they're going to respond. You know, and to your point of like the feedback after when you're in the theater, it's like, I think sometimes people are so afraid of addressing these topics in the workplace because they're like, well, if we open the door, we're going to hear all these things. And my response is, well, you should want to, because you shouldn't want this happening in your organization. But even more so, I would rather catch a problem when it was at a 1, as opposed to when it was at a 10, as opposed to when it was at a 50, it was 100, right? Like, we're looking at a scale. And I think so many people are afraid of opening that door. And I say, well, again, if it's happening, we need to stop it. But even more so when we normalize a culture where people are comfortable speaking up, even if they're speaking up about the smallest of things, fantastic. because we can address it right away. We can stop it. We can cut it off. We can let it, we can end it. Because I think that that's where toxicity builds. And every time people are like, well, how did that culture get to that point? I'm like, because they weren't addressing it. They weren't talking about it as it went on and on, that it happened. Everyone saw it happen. No one said anything. So then the person who did it learned, I can do this and get away with it. And then what usually happens is other people see that, and other people say, well, so-and-so did this and they didn't get in trouble. Nothing happened to them. So I'm going to do it. I'm going to engage in those things. And it builds and it builds and it builds and it gets worse because there's someone who's going to test the water and they're going to push, especially if they want to, they're going to do that pushing.
So true. So true. Tim, what an amazing interview. I mean, this was beautiful to dive into that so difficult topic. And whilst I've had many sexual abuse survivors on my show, it is the clarity with which you have outlined the problem and the solutions that you offer the people that you work with, the organizations that you work with, that has made this interview outstanding. And you're an amazing man. It is a really important message. And I'm absolutely bloody honored to have you on my show. I'm very, very grateful. If people want to contact you and want to work more with you, how can they find you?
Yeah, the best. Well, first, thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate the chance to be here and just, again, the platform and your willingness to have this conversation. The best way to get in touch with me is just through my website, timmousseau.com. So just first name, last name.com. I have, links to my socials there, but there's a contact form. I regularly publish material that I'm writing or videos I'm creating there, other podcasts, things of that nature. And so that's always the best way to stay in touch with what I'm doing.
Beautiful. And guys, look down there into the description of the YouTube video and of the podcast. And whilst you're down there, press that subscribe button. Come on, guys. And when you're subscribing, you might as well go that extra step. Find one person in your tribe, in your group of people, and tell that person, hey, why don't you check My Steps to Sobriety out? That dude is onto something. He is bringing on some really cool people, and he is having some really in-depth conversations about things that might be of interest to you. So if we can spread the word, and if we get actually the word out there that it's okay not to be okay, and that there is actually hope, and that by us connecting and opening up about our journeys, that maybe that might be the solution to so many problems, I like to believe that we can change this world one interview at a time, one discussion at a time. And I think, let's make this world a better place. It deserves to. Cool. Tim, thank you so much for coming onto my show. Absolutely delighted. And you guys out there, look after yourself. Stay strong. I believe in you. Come on, you can make it happen. Bye.